All right, Alok. Help us understand the basics of the net and the wins against the bubble. Maybe we're calling it WAB. I don't know. But let's start with we want to really lay this down to its foundation. How does it work?
Yeah. So the two metrics kind of go together. They represent two different sides of the sort of team performance. Net, which stands for NCAA Evaluation Tool, system that's been around for about 5+ years, tries to look at how good teams are based on their on-court play. Key factor is efficiency, and it's really adjusted efficiency. So not, your points per possession relative to your opponent's points per possession, but adjusted for where you play, home, road, or neutral, and of course, importantly, who you play. How good is the opposition? And so that's the main kind of component in that, and it's designed to really measure how good teams are, and that is used. Net is used to rank the opponents on your team sheet. So it's really important for like more measuring who you played, who you beat than your own net, though that kind of gets you in the conversation.
So,
Go ahead.
one quick thing, if I want to just stop you here. In comparison, um, this is more of a data-driven metric, not a predictive one. Is that correct?
Net is more predictive. It's
Oh, it is. Okay.
actually it is data driven to be predictive. So when you look at a team's efficiency, that actually happens to be more predictive of their future performance. So if you look at other metrics that are similar, like Ken Pom, Torvik, and the past Sagarin, they're also looking at similar factors to predict a team's performance. The difference with the net is it doesn't use any information from outside of the season. There's no preseason ranking. There's nothing
Yeah, that's
about,
what I meant. Okay.
past seasons or recruiting. So it isn't as predictive in the early part of the season because it only has a limited amount of data to work with. By the time you get to Selection Sunday, net actually looks pretty similar if you look in past years to Ken Pom and other metrics like that.
So one quick follow-up to that, and we've seen this in the past. It feels like the first release in December tends to have an outlier. Every year, one or two that might have done well in the first month of the season, but more than likely, because of whatever conference they're in, it's not going to hold its position in that top 20 or 30. How true is that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to it. We released the net early, earlier than maybe some people would be comfortable with. I think it got better. There was a tweak made to the net that I worked on in 2020 or so, and that put in the adjusted efficiency. So it actually isn't as wild as it looked maybe those first year or two at the early release. I think the point is though, like without knowing kind of where all the conferences stand relative to each other, it's kind of hard for the algorithm to know exactly where everyone stands that early when you're only maybe let's say 7 or 8 games in per team. Once you get to like January, a lot of the non-conference play has kind of worked itself out, and you have a relative understanding of where these conferences and teams stand relative to each other. I think it looks a lot better. And then once you get towards the end of the season, you now have 30 games of data for every team, and it looks a lot more realistic.
So a lot of times on television, we'll use quad one, quad two, quad three, quad four. What's the best way to explain that?
Yeah, so I think and this also helps get us to where wins against bubble comes into play. But kind of outside of that for now, quads are the way, we try to define difficulty of each of a win, right? So there's ways to do it kind of continuously. Quads are kind of discrete, where we say like, hey, the hardest wins are in what we call quad one. So it's usually a team that's ranked very high. And then the scale is just a little bit larger for if you win on the road, because it's about as hard to beat, a team on the road that's 75th as maybe on neutral court at 50th, and then maybe like 25th at home. The exact numbers might vary, but the concept is essentially like, we're counting for the fact that winning on the road is harder. And then quad two is sort of that next bucket of opponents where like you probably should win these. A bubble team might probably win these games, but there's some room for error. And then quads 3 and 4 are actually pretty similar in that like most of the time a tournament team should win those games. Quad 4 is like the sort of easiest of them.
All right, so now let's go to win against the bubble, where that factors in, because that's sort of a newer addition.
Yep. So yeah, the concept is not super new. There's a ESPN strength of record, a metric that I worked on, has existed for 10+ years now. And then there's versions of this wins above bubble or wins against bubble metric that has existed for a while as well. And the concept is essentially that you're not necessarily looking at team performance in a predictive way. What you're trying to do is measure their resume. So how good were the teams that they beat? So if you win by 1 on a buzzer beater or you win by 30, on your resume, that still counts as a win, right? And this metric is very tied to that. So what it kind of does is it looks at each opponent, how hard they were to beat using net. So this is where they kind of come together. Net comes first, right? Rates kind of how good every team is. Therefore, how hard are they to beat, predictively sense. And then that feeds into wins against bubble. For each game, you get a sort of how hard is it to win this game. So if you play number 1 on the road, that's the hardest possible game you could play. If you play number 350 at home, that's among the easiest games you play. And then there's some chance that we use an average bubble team, which we count as the 45th ranked team in net based on past data analysis, to set the baseline for how hard it is. So if you play a 300 plus team, average bubble team should win that 99.5% of the time, right? If you play number 1 ranked team on the road, maybe you would win that only 5% of the time. And you basically get the opposite credit for what you do. So if you win a game, you should win 99% of the time, you get 1% credit. If you win that other game on the road against the number 1 team, you get 95% credit. And all those, and then again, if you lose, that you get kind of the opposite. So if you lose that really easy game, you lose 99%. If you lose to number 1 team, you only lose 5% because that's a hard win. Those little fractions of a win add up over the course of the season, and you get a number that's how many wins you have relative to what a bubble team would do against your schedule. So it's adjusted for your schedule. It's kind of just like taking win-loss and adjusting for schedule. So we talk a lot about strength of schedule, which is important. This is how did you do against that schedule? So when you see teams who rank really high in strength of schedule but don't do well, those teams don't get much consideration for the tournament. This is kind of the right baseline, taking account your wins and your schedule.
So one thing that and help me out here if I've forgotten something, but one thing that I'm always interested in is how it changes. So if you got a great win in November against a team or December, that metric wise, was doing the right things, they were ranked and so on, and it was maybe on the road or even a neutral.
Yep.
But then come February, that team has really struggled.
Yep.
And now the win doesn't look as good. But when you beat them, maybe they were whole. Maybe they've had an injury. How do you judge that on a metric basis?
Yeah, I think that is, one of the things to be aware of. Like, obviously, no system is perfect, and this is like that. So you get credit for the win based on the net of the team at the latest iteration of net. So there is evidence kind of both ways. So like, basically, I don't know how good the team is 5 games into the season. Maybe they were really good. By the end, they're not as good, but we should probably credit something in between, like where they were and where they are. Right now, we do where they are at the most recent time. I think the most interesting cases are where there's an injury or something like that, where a key player goes out. And I think that's where the committee's judgment is really useful, right? So you can be like, oh, okay, we know that, let's say, net is rating this team like this. We think they were better at this time. It was because of this key factor. Wins against bubble is taking that win and giving a team not as much credit for the win. We should actually give them a little more. So when we're comparing 2 teams side by side, when there's some more subjective factors that can come into play, just knowing the facts like that, I think, can be helpful.
And lastly, a lot of times late in the season, we'll see, well, now, Team X suddenly got another good win, and now they're in quad 2 instead of 3. So the quad 1 team actually now gets a quad 2 win instead of a quad 3 win. How does that all play into it?
Yeah. So I think, like, again, a little bit of my personal opinion here. I think like wins against bubble is a really good advancement to kind of work around like some of these issues at the edges of the quad system. So you have like, is there really a big difference between the 50th and the 51st ranked team? Like, no, essentially they're the same, right? But because you draw the cut line somewhere, one falls in quad 1, one falls in quad 2, happen to have a weird result one day, and now you got one extra quad win, and like wins against bubble is going to take that continuously. So it'll say, oh, this was worth half a win. Okay, now today maybe it's worth 0.51 of a win. not a big difference, right? So that's good. And then the other thing with the quads is like games within the quad can be different. So there's like certain quad one wins that are like, really impressive. You go beat, Kansas, Duke, UNC on the road. That's a lot different than maybe the 50th ranked team. So you have kind of differences within the quad as well, and wins against bubble will take that into account. So obviously, I'm a big fan of this. It's a new thing that the committee has adopted. I think it's a really good advancement, and hopefully they'll get more comfortable with it as we go through the selection process.
All right. Did I forget anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate it. And hopefully this will continue to educate everyone.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andy.